Police say this man horrifically murdered his family, but 47 years on, he's still not been found. On July 3, 1970, two cliff rescue volunteers, George Cumming and Cecil Burgin, attempted to access an abandoned car. The vehicle was perched on a rocky ledge at Loch Ard George near the village of Port Campbell in Victoria, Australia. Homicide Squad detective Adrian Donahue watched and waited. The sea churned darkly beneath him. After descending 52 feet down a sheer cliff face, Cumming and Burgin arrived at the vehicle, peered inside, and saw a sheet covering something. "We lifted the tarpaulin and Sec Burgin said, 'I can see some feet,'" Cumming told Australian newspaper the Herald Sun in 2008. "When the tarpaulin was moved, a bedspread was folded back and I saw 4 bodies wrapped in bedsheets." These were the remains of Therese Crawford, 35, her 8-year-old son James, and her 2 daughters, Catherine, 13, and Karen, 6. The death of a family is shocking under any circumstances, but it was not until Detective Donahue examined the bodies that the true brutality of how they met their fate became apparent. Notably absent from the vehicle was Elmer Crawford, Therese's husband and the father of James, Catherine, and Karen. Living with his family in the Melbourne suburb of Glenroy, Elmer worked as an electrician for the Victoria Racing Club at Flemington. And by all outward appearances, he seemed to be a steady sort of man. Indeed, he'd worked the same job for 14 years. In fact, as far as his colleagues were concerned, there was nothing to suggest that Crawford had an evil or sadistic temperament, let alone the capacity to kill. But in July 1971, a coroner's inquest concluded that Crawford had slaughtered his own family in their suburban home. And somewhat disturbingly, he's never been caught and consequently never faced trial. Specifically, the inquest found that Crawford, after killing his family, had loaded their bodies into his 1956 Holden sedan and driven hundreds of miles to the rugged coast of Port Campbell National Park. He parked by the edge of a blowhole at Loch Ard Gorge. Then, in an apparent attempt to make their deaths appear like a murder-suicide, he fixed a hose to the exhaust pipe and fed it into a window. After that, the inquest ruled that he pushed the car over the edge. Believing that it had crashed into the sea, the coroner suggested he then made his way back to Glenroy, possibly on a scooter that he transported in the trunk. However, Crawford appeared to be unaware that the car had in fact landed on a ledge above the water. And on July 2, 1970, 2 tourists spotted it and called the authorities. Moreover, Crawford's motive for his alleged crime has never been firmly established, although there are several plausible theories. One possibility is that he had hoped to inherit his wife's wealth. After all, she had drawn up her will a mere fortnight before her death. Another theory suggests that Therese was about to reveal Crawford's long-running criminal shenanigans. For years, he'd been stealing from his employer and fencing stolen goods. However, if Crawford felt the need to silence his wife, this doesn't explain why he supposedly murdered his children too. Finally, the murders may have somehow been connected to Therese's unwanted 4th pregnancy, a source of domestic tension, according to an unfinished letter she composed to her family. "I've been so upset," she wrote, "but what's the use? I'm 2.5 months now, so looks like I've had it this time." Whatever his apparent motive, Crawford appeared to have planned the alleged murders carefully. Shortly after the discovery and identification of his car, police officer John McCarty knocked on his door. At that stage, however, cliff rescue experts had not accessed his vehicle, nor had they discovered the bodies. So when no one came to the door, McCarty simply walked away. In fact, it's likely that Crawford was inside the house at the time, attempting to clean away some bloodstains. Moreover, when the police returned a few hours later, they decided to forcibly gain entry. It was then they discovered a slew of grisly evidence revealing exactly how Crawford had apparently murdered his family. But Crawford himself had fled. The 1971 inquest found that Crawford had used 2 different weapons to murder his family. The first was a homemade contraption consisting of a 50-foot-long electrical cable with 5 leads. According to the coroner, Crawford attached these leads to the bodies of his sleeping wife and children using alligator clips. He then electrocuted all of them except his 6-year-old daughter, Karen. She was to meet a different, bloodier end. Shockingly, Karen was bludgeoned to death with a hammer, again allegedly at the hands of her father. After that, Crawford is said to have set about fracturing the skulls of his 2 other children. The inquest ruled that he left Teresa's head intact, possibly to fabricate the appearance of a murder-suicide. Meanwhile, when the killing frenzy stopped, the house was a bloody mess. Incredibly, despite several large-scale manhunts, Crawford has thus far managed to evade the authorities. However, there have been a number of reported sightings of him over the years. In 1994, a former acquaintance thought she saw him at a hotel in Bunbury in Western Australia. Furthermore, when she inquired as to the man's identity, he said he was a tourist. Then in 2005, U.S. police investigators thought they may have located Crawford's body in a morgue. With multiple false names about his person and mangled fingerprints, the individual in question was evidently very concerned with hiding his true identity. However, DNA tests eventually ruled that the body was not that of Crawford. Most recently, an individual called Nugget Wright told police he may have met Crawford in the far-flung Pilbara region in Western Australia. "We started asking questions," Wright said of the encounter, according to a report published by 7 News Melbourne in October 2017. "It turns out," he said, "he was from Melbourne. I said, 'Where's your missus?' He told me she was long gone." Wright continued, "I asked, 'Why did you leave Melbourne?' And he said, 'I had to leave in a hurry. I did something terrible.' And that's when the penny dropped. I said, 'You aren't that bloke the Victorian coppers were up here looking for a couple weeks ago.' His whole body language changed. His head dropped, his shoulders shrank, and he had that attitude, 'Oh shit, I've told this bloke too much.'" Crawford would be in his late 80s today, if still alive, and although he's enjoyed a life of liberty, it's never too late for him to face trial. It's horrific that a father could kill his wife and his own children, slaughter them in their very home. Former cop Damian Jackson told the Herald Sun, "We would dearly love to solve this one." Indeed, and one person who would certainly appreciate closure is retired Detective Donahue. "We were very satisfied that he was the person we were looking for," he told Australian news site The Standard in 2017. "The crime is definitely solvable, if you get the right information. But until then, the case remains open."